Hi, my name's Sumita Lall. I've been teaching here for around 5 years, a couple years part-time, and then after that full-time. I tend to teach a lot of basic skills classes because I enjoy them. And when I first started teaching college at a community college back in Canada, it was in 1995, tells you how old I am, but I was teaching a basic skills, what was called then a remedial class, and it was for students who had not passed their college entrance writing test, and they were really taking this class, this remedial class, to improve their writing. So since then, I've always been drawn to the basic skills classroom, and I find it challenging but also very rewarding. And I want to share with you today some of the tips that I've learned in teaching at this level. And I also want to share with you some of the concepts that developmental teachers discuss when we are talking about the best kinds of practices for getting through to basic skills students. Hi, welcome to a Tutor and SI workshop. It's a basic skills sensitivity training. I'm going to be covering two different ideas here. I want us to think about what the basic skills student is, give that some thought. I'm sure you've all encountered a basic skills student, even if you really can't identify immediately what the traits are. But I'd like you to give it some thought. The other thing we're going to be covering is why we use standard English when we're teaching writing and when we're tutors and SIs in composition. Because that's a debated field anyway. Standard English is something that, we tend to just accept as the norm, but it's also something we can discuss as tutors, SIs, and as instructors. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes, and I'm asking the basic question, what is a basic skills student? I'm going to give it some thought. Imagine all the scenarios you've been in when you've been helping students in the past. I want you to think about some of the traits they possess, maybe some of the things they do. Have you noticed any challenges they might have? So take 2 minutes, just write down, brainstorm, as we do in English all the time. You all know about brainstorming. Write down a few ideas. Just jot down some points about your impressions of a basic skills student. And if you can't think of actual traits, try to define the term, because it has negative connotations. I mean, when we think basic, it can be very negative. But I want you to sort of write down what you think it could mean, basic skills. All right, so now that you've given that some thought, I want you to share with each other. Since I'm here virtually, you won't be able to share with me, but share with each other. Maybe share with a friend who's near you. Maybe you're watching this or listening to this with a friend. What are some of those traits? Some things that might have come up in your brainstorming. Maybe a student is struggling with some reading. They might be struggling with just words, being able to decipher words. They might be skipping over words as they're reading. There are other things that you might have come up with. The student is shy. Maybe that student doesn't really seek the help he or she needs. Usually those students who have the least skills are not going to be self-aware enough to seek the help to address those skills or problems with learning. So in many ways, our efforts, and especially under the Title V grant and under some of the new initiatives we're making on campus, our efforts are to make tutoring centers, SIs, and all the help on campus more accessible to students who wouldn't necessarily go out and seek that help. Okay, so I guess the idea I want you to think about as we move on to the next slide, when we think about this basic skills student, the word remedial is the word that was used in the past to describe these students. So they're often referred to as remedial because they are all struggling to acquire successful study skills, flexibility in their use of strategies while reading, fluency in writing standard English, and a better understanding of grammar, syntax, and appropriate social roles in college. You'll find that quotation in a handbook that I developed a couple of years ago. It's called Helping the Basic Skills Student. And the Tutoring Center has it, the SI program has it. It's a 30-page document, very, easy to get through, but it has some exercises in there. It also has some information about basic skills students. So the idea of remedial implies an idea that really implies that there's something that needs to be fixed. Can anyone just sort of break down that word? try and think about that word remedial. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. So what does the word remedial suggest? The word remedy comes to mind. So it's no surprise that the word means the correction of faulty study habits and the raising of a student's general competence. I think why we've gotten away from the idea of remedial is that students really will not learn if they feel as though they possess something that is wrong, that they are faulty, that there's something that needs correcting. So we tend not to use the word remedial. We tend instead to use the word developmental. There are certain learning skills that students need to have if they're going to be successful in college that requires maybe some help initially. They need to develop those skills. So we refer to basic skill students as developmental students and developmental composition over remedial students and remedial compositions. So if you're ever working with a student and revising a draft, you definitely don't want to use the word remedial in any way to suggest who they are as students. Really, we're not trying to fix anything. We're simply trying to nudge students toward more appropriate social roles. So remember that definition of the basic skill students on the first slide, or on the second slide after the introduction, that we're really trying to help them understand more appropriate social roles in college. But that includes the use of language. It includes an understanding of what they need to do to become better students and writers and readers. And that word flexibility is important because most of us who are successful in school, we can adapt to most situations easily, or at least we know what to do to make ourselves better students. So we have what's called academic perseverance. If we fail or fall, we pick ourselves up and we keep walking and we try our best. We're not afraid to fail. We're not afraid to fall. But a lot of students who are basic skills, they're very afraid of falling and failing. So some of the images on that first slide, you saw the student who was biting her nails, the student who was maybe juggling too many responsibilities, holding up champagne glasses. That was the other image on that screen, trying to balance all those glasses. Maybe they're a waitress or a waiter. They're working many hours, but they're also trying to be better students. But it's a really difficult balance for a lot of students to understand. And so we're trying to help them in a number of ways, not just with their composition, but we're trying to make them stronger students, and we're trying to help them feel more confident about their identities as students as they're becoming better writers. So I think the second part of that definition on this slide that we're covering right now, what does the word remedial suggest? I think the second part of the definition is helpful, that the raising of a student's general competence is what is implied by the word remedy. So we're not really trying to correct faulty study habits, but we're trying to raise their general competence. So what's written here is the second part of the definition is helpful, but the first part is what usually comes to mind and is neither helpful nor useful. I'm going to start now bringing up this topic of standard English, because part of what we're trying to help students understand is the use of proper English or standard English, which goes alongside appropriate social roles in college. So what we mean by standard English, or what do we mean by standard English or correct or proper English? I want you to give that some thought for a couple of minutes, just like you did when you were defining basic skills student. I want you to think about correct or proper or standard English. What does it mean? Okay, so you've given that some thought, and I'm just going to share with you my thoughts about language. Language is very social. It's something we learn through practice. It's a product of function. We know what is correct. We know what is incorrect based on how a language is being used. We don't know what is correct and what is incorrect just based on the rules we learn, grammar rules we learn from a handbook, or the lessons we learn sitting in a classroom. So I think the way we need to think about language when we're dealing with basic skill students is we need to remember that most of us who are successful speakers, writers, who are successful readers, that we have a history that may have contributed to our ease with language and our confidence in ourselves as speakers and writers. Many of you may recall your parents read to you when you were young, You may have been reading books from a very young age. You may have even opened up your first book in infancy, as I'm doing with my own daughter right now, opening up books, making her feel comfortable and very natural around books by sort of being tactile with them, kinesthetic with them, holding them, turning the pages. All of that contributes to an ease with language because it's language in use. It's being used or it's in function. It's a product of its function. So I think what we need to keep in mind is that students who are comfortable with language have heard it, have read it, have practiced it themselves in their own social circles, in their family settings. They've used it privately, they've used it publicly, they have not been shamed. They probably have a better confidence in their own voices, in the sound of their voices, in their use of words. So if any of you raised these traits, some of these traits of basic skill students, you were right on. A basic skill student is not confident and they're very afraid of failing. They probably they don't have the same experience we have in the class, in our homes or in the classroom. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is a quotation from an essay by Amy Tan. And the essay is called Mother Tongue. Some of you may have read it in English 1A because you're tutors and SI leaders, so you may have encountered this essay before in Mother Tongue in a class that you've taken. And the quotation I'd like you to read to yourself, but I'll read it with you. I'm conscious of the English I do use with her. She's referring to her mother. It has become our language of intimacy, a different sort of English that related to family talk, the language I grew up with. In this essay, Amy Tan is really describing the particular forms of English that her mother speaks. Some of it is for business purposes, other use of English is more for intimate relations, like to talk with her daughter, to talk with people within the family. She describes 4 different types of English, one of which is a broken English. So I think what she's describing here is really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about students who are struggling with language. They have not made the language their own. They don't own the language. And they not only do not own the language, they also do not understand the different functions of different forms of language in different contexts. Most of us are pretty performative with language. We know how to speak with our friends, how to change that speech when we speak to an instructor, how to change that speech when we speak to someone we love. And that's a kind of fluency that comes with practice and with time. And it's something that we can really speak about in terms of flexibility and adaptability. And also in self-awareness, the ability to understand how we are performing the language in different contexts. So I think that quotation is really important when we're thinking about the basic skill student, because a lot of students don't have that language of intimacy, and definitely they don't have the experience of intimacy with a book or written text. They haven't been reading for a very long time, and now they're suddenly in college, and they're expected to make sense of the words on the page and to be able to write about those words, much less speak about those words. The next quotation I want to move to is from an essay called Aria by Richard Rodriguez. And it's a very interesting essay. It's one that I think really speaks to class and the issue of class. He says, as a socially disadvantaged child, I considered Spanish to be a private language. What I did not believe was that I could speak a single public language. So we've addressed some of these issues already. Private language versus public language. I think what might really help tutors and SI leaders, what really helps me as an instructor who has been working with basic skill students, is I like to get a sense of a student's own private use of language. And I try not to shame the student when I hear certain kinds of language being used in the classroom. What I try to do instead is to remind the student that that particular language has a different social function, and that there's a poetry to that language, but it just belongs in a different context. Of course, I'm speaking more academically with you. I'm describing to you some of the theoretical things about language, but with a student, really, I think the important thing is just to keep them feeling comfortable practicing the language and not punishing them for experimenting with the language or trying new words. And they may be very awkward, and they may not exactly know how to use a word. They may be over-relying on a thesaurus, but I think we need to reward students for doing that, for at least trying. So I'd like to move on to the next slide. As I'm doing that, you will see a definition of standard English on this slide. And I have a definition that I've taken from the handbook that I wrote, the handbook and workbook that is available through the Tutoring Center in addressing the basic skills student. But for just a minute or so, just kind of think about what you would use to describe the word standard English. What do you think it means, standard English? So on this slide, I've provided you with the definition from the handbook that I wrote. Standard English refers to the variety of English language which is normally employed in writing and normally spoken by educated speakers of the language. You'll notice in the definition that it also covers the variety of English that students of English as foreign or second language, EFL and ESL, are taught. And it refers to grammar and vocabulary, the dialect, but not to pronunciation accent. What you want to keep in mind is that most students who are EFL or ESL, traditional EFL, English as foreign language, English as second language, they have a foundation in one language before they have taken on English. So they have the building blocks for understanding the second language because they have a clear sense of what their first language is. And they have the grammatical structures from their first language. They have a sense of the syntax, the rhythm of that language. They understand language. But often when we're dealing with a basic skills student, that student really doesn't have a foundational language. That student is struggling with language in general. And when I say that, what I mean is that they may be able to speak the language pretty fluently and sound fluent. But if you really listen, you may pick up on some problems. But they sound really fluent. I mean, they're able to carry conversations. They're able to sound like native speakers. But in fact, when we look at their writing, we're seeing a lot of traits that indicate that they are actually English and some other language, that they are second language learners. They are learning actually an initial language, and they don't have the foundation in one language. So they are oral learners. They learn through hearing. They are oral speakers. They speak. Well, what I mean by that is they speak the language and they understand it through the spoken word, but they have a lot of trouble with the written language. The second language learner that we're talking about has a foundation, whereas the student who is a basic skills student probably doesn't have a foundational language. And so what I've written in the handbook is an easy way to remember the meaning of standard English is to think of the kind of language and the kind of English language instructors expect students to use when writing academic essays. So that the standard I was expected to use as a student in Canada, I'm Canadian, and the language that I learned was British English. The spelling is different, some of the words are different, the pronunciation is obviously different, but we're not talking about pronunciation here. We're not talking about accent, we're talking about only the language itself and the formal traits of the language. So my training in the language is actually quite different from what students have received who were born and raised in the U.S. and have had lessons in high school and grade school. So what we refer to as North American English is actually the standard. And one thing we want to keep in mind is that there are many dialects, there are many ways of speaking, and there are many ways of understanding the language that may not fall within the realm of standard English. And part of our job is to respect students for their origins, to get a sense of who they are as speakers of the language, and to really make them comfortable with the idea that that language might be useful in a different setting. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And I would like to just sort of discuss those in two quotations from the slide before the definition of the standard English. Some of you have given some thought to this already, but what I would say is what Amy Tam refers to as perfect English and what Richard Rodriguez refers to as public English is the same language that students are expected to be proficient in or work on mastering in college. Perfect and public English. And it is very useful. It's something that we're helping students to understand because we want them to be able to take all their lessons from college and be able to use their skills in a work setting and to look educated, that they've received lessons on what is standard, perfect public English. It doesn't mean we expect these students suddenly to change overnight and become perfect public standard speakers all of the time, and we need to honor when they speak a different language or dialect in a different setting. So what I've written here on the slide is, however, a person needs to use and practice standard English in order to understand it. Students can't just study English and understand standard English, they have to practice it. Becoming competent in language is about trial and error, and basic skill students need encouragement to make mistakes. That might be something that I think we all need to sort of remind ourselves of. This idea of failing and falling and how useful it is to fail and fall. And I think all of us can think of different instances in our own lives. Maybe we started in a field, in a particular program or in a department, in a field of study, and we realized that field wasn't good for us. Most of us have what's called academic perseverance, so we didn't suddenly decide to, drop out of school and not pursue a career in college or a degree. We decided that at some point that we just needed to change our path and try something new. And that skill is something that basic skills students do not possess. They are not confident learners. They probably will react more negatively to a negative statement about the language they are using than a student who is aware of some of the struggles that he or she is experiencing. And so I want you to keep that in mind, that there are different uses of English, and standard English is simply the most useful for an academic setting and for the job setting. So we want to encourage our students to make mistakes. So I've already told you, the little story about, what I do with my daughter and how I open up books and I read to her and I try to get her to feel comfortable with the written word and with books themselves. But I want you to think about this question. Why do you think standard English might be a challenge for some non-native? When I say non-native, I mean those who lack the foundation in any one language because they may have relied on dialects since birth. So why do you think standard English might be a challenge for some non-native and native speakers? Maybe students who have dropped out of high school or are first-generation college students. Why do you think standard English might be a challenge for them? You want to give that some thought for a couple of minutes and maybe write down some of your ideas and what you think could be a response to that question. Okay, so my answer would be many students lack confidence in their roles as students. They are motivationally challenged and need assistance in improving their own roles as students, their own language. And all of this comes from the Basic Skills Student Handbook. I put a blank on the sheet you might have to accompany this PowerPoint slide because I want you to actually look at the Basic Skills Handbook. A lot of times when we're being trained as tutors and SIs, we're given a lot of information, a lot of material, and a lot of times we might just put a handbook to the side and not really look at it. And I want you to actually take it out at some point. And on page 2, you'll notice that I've given you my answer to that question. And I think we have to keep the issue of confidence in mind all the time. So there are a couple of workbook exercises that I also want to draw your attention to. They're on pages 11 to 12 of the handbook. And they're the exercises 1 and 2. And at some point you might consider doing those exercises. They're easy and fun. They're not meant to really be daunting or require a lot of time, but they're really just to get you to think about your own roles as student helpers, as students who are there to coach and to assist and to address more than just writing needs, to help other students gain confidence in their roles as students. Okay, so on your handout, if you have that handout, you will notice that I've listed several roles that a basic skills tutor and an SI leader might take on. Cheerleader is one. I know a lot of us are kind of more cynical, but when you are working with a basic skills student, you actually have to be more enthusiastic than you want to be. It's like you have to trick yourself into a position of complete enthusiasm. And a lot of that acting goes a long way, even if you're not feeling enthusiastic on a particular day. So when I teach my English 3 class, I walk into the room and I over-enunciate words, and I try not to, I try to still use vocabulary that I would normally use with my friends, but I repeat words, I define words, I treat my students as equals in many ways, that they are as much invested in learning as I am in teaching and that I am in learning from them. So cheerleader role is actually really important, because I think the more you encourage students to try something new and fall and fail and then pick themselves up again and try again, the more they're going to feel comfortable with learning. The other role you might want to consider is as peer role model. You are all ideal students. You've all been able to sort of understand what you can accomplish in a school setting. So as much as possible, if a student brings you a challenge, you might try to take their position, empathy, like identify with what they're going through, put yourself in their shoes and understand the challenge from their perspective. I have been known to embellish myself in a classroom setting where I will maybe exaggerate something I experienced in the past, a struggle with a particular language issue, and I tend to be very transparent about some of those challenges and actually embellish on them so that students know that even as someone who has worked hard and accomplished many things in life, that I've also struggled with the language. So you want to role model as much as possible. Show them your struggles and they'll learn to pick themselves up. You want to be a collaborator. You don't want to be someone who talks down to students as an authority. Of course, you are an authority because you understand the language and can help them, guide them to the right page in a handbook to understand a grammatical lesson. But you really are a collaborator with them. You're trying to understand how they use the language and then how they can learn standard English to advance themselves in certain areas of their lives. And then the last thing is I want you to think of yourself as a liaison between the instructor and the student. You are not the instructor and you are not the ultimate authority, but you are there to create a better connection between those who are providing the instruction, the instructor, and then the student who might be struggling. So keep in mind that you do a really important job of communicating between the student and the instructor. And then also maybe alleviating some of the fears the student might be having based on your reaction to some of the lectures. If you're an SI leader and you've attended a couple of lectures and something is not clear to you, let that instructor know that from a basic skills angle, a particular lesson was not clear. And most instructors who are working with SI leaders will be able to adapt their lesson and repeat and reinforce concepts and will not take offense because we're here to work together. Okay, so the final slide that you'll see is a quotation from Lives on the Boundary, The Struggles and Achievements of America's Underprepared. It's an older book. It's from 1989, but I really do like this book. It's by Mike Rose, and he's written quite a bit about working class lives, and he's written about his own experience in the classroom, in the community college setting, in university, and his own experience as a teacher of basic skills students who in 1989 were called remedial students. And his quotation is, and you can read it yourself, but I'll read it with you because I can't ask for volunteers right now. My students needed to be immersed in talking, reading, and writing. They needed to further develop their ability to think critically, and they needed to gain confidence in themselves as systematic inquirers. They had to be let into the academic club. The fact that they misspelled words or wrote fragments or dropped verb endings would not erect insurmountable barriers to the benefits they would gain from such immersion. Some of the key words from that quotation, you can give it some thought. Take a couple minutes. Just look at that quotation carefully. If you were to circle any key words, what would they be? Okay, so some of the terms might be to further develop their ability. They needed to further develop their ability to think critically. So further develop their ability to think critically, to gain confidence. That would be a term you could circle as important. Now, this idea of systematic inquirers, students who are basic skills really don't have the structure behind them. They don't have the organization. They're often struggling students who are struggling with study skills. So part of our job is just to show them how to break things down, how to be analytical, to break ideas down, to break the study process down. So to be systematic inquirers, really to show them the process by which to ask questions and to feel confident asking those questions. And then this idea of an academic club really addresses what we've been covering so far about standard English. Standard English is kind of like a club. Those who speak it, those who know how to use it are probably better off in life. We need to allow more and more students into this private club. It's just something we need to do and not shame students as they're trying to make that transition. And then this idea of misspelled words, fragments, dropped verb endings. All of these so-called flaws, and they're problems in an academic context, but would never be problems in any other context. Most of these problems or challenges are ones that take time and may take up to 4 or 5 semesters of work. It's not something that you can be expected to help students correct within 4 months of one semester. So you want to keep in mind that there's only so much you can do at each SI session or tutoring session, as long as you are keeping in mind the overall goal. And immersion, that's another key word from that slide, because if you think of language acquisition and understanding language and acquiring a language, immersion tends to be very successful. That we are not only immersing basic skills students in language, but we're immersing them in a college culture. And the more we can model for them the expectations you might have for them, basic forms of exchange between students, like how to conduct conversations in a respectful way, how to talk about readings or essays that they might bring to you, the kinds of questions you might ask as a student if you were to encounter a reading for the first time. Be very transparent. Show them all of the processes that go into taking apart, analyzing a reading or a question or a prompt, and then show them what you might find challenging and be very open about that. You don't have to be experts, and in fact, being an expert will actually work to your disadvantage when you're working with a basic skill student. You want to keep your expertise quiet. You want to show them rather than tell them. So the last point I want to make is that, when I'm in a basic skills classroom, I find I'm the most challenged as a teacher. I find that my best traits have to sort of shine and they have to surface. I can't really rely on the student to pull me through that class. I have to actually exaggerate some of the traits that I've mentioned. Cheerleader, be very enthusiastic, enunciate your words, explain concepts in a way that is engaging instead of in a way that's condescending. So repeating ideas but asking for some feedback while you're repeating an idea. And if they nod their heads and say they get it, you're on the same page. So your best traits have to surface. And what I'm saying here is that it is the most challenging teaching you may ever encounter. Because in order to be successful with a basic skills student, you have to have confidence in your own knowledge and abilities, and you have to be real. You have to make learning approachable and not intimidating. You have to ask questions of yourself and others. You have to reveal what you do and do not know, and that's the biggest challenge. If I do not know something, the last thing I would ever do to a basic skills student is to try to trick them. And, if you do not know something, be very clear that you need to look at a handbook. They're going to bring you all kinds of questions. And then as you're looking at that handbook, tell them, see what I'm doing here. I don't know everything about MLA documentation. I obviously have to go to a handbook to find the details and the answers to the question. But even grammatical questions, if you don't know how to explain subject-verb agreement, we have a whole series of directed learning activities that you can pull up from the file and walk them through the process of understanding subject-verb agreement. So if you don't know something, simply show them what you would do as a student to get the answer. And that is part of training a basic skills student. You don't always have to just help them find the answer. You have to show them the process and finding it for themselves. And be as human as possible. Show as much empathy. Show and use empathy liberally. Put yourselves in their position and try to understand what they've been through with language, and I think you'll be very successful. So I thank you for your time and effort, and I want to just direct you to a couple of resources, one of which is the Tutoring Center website, and on the left-hand column, you'll find the Reading Writing Center website, and I'd like you to click on that and try and look at some of the resources that are available. We have most of the things that I've referred to, the Basic Skills Handbook, the directed learning activities, some websites that are useful, but also some training that you can find there. And if you have any questions about basic skills students, that website will also give you a list of instructors and resources on campus, people who have been working with basic skills students for quite some time. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from you if you ever need any help.